Hi everyone, your book has a brief section on how social class affects us, but I wanted to take an opportunity to give you a more in-depth look at the consequences of living in absolute poverty. So your book does talk a little bit about absolute and relative poverty. Here we're talking about poverty where people don't have enough to meet the basic needs of their life, not just wants, and that this is long-term and enduring poverty also. So first up, let's talk about consequences of living in poverty on your education. So this actually starts really early. So by the age of 3, children born into low-income families have heard roughly 30 million fewer words than their more affluent peers. And this really matters in terms of their language development. So by 18 months of age, they're several months behind more affluent peers. And this keeps going. By the time they reach kindergarten, they're fairly far behind peers who are better off financially. Adding to that is a difference in preschool gaps. Since most preschools they still involve some type of tuition, children in poverty are less likely to attend preschool, with 63% of children in poverty not attending compared to 45% of children above the line, which just sort of continues that gap going. Also, if you are poor, you're more likely to live in a poor neighborhood. And because we draw our school lines by neighborhood, that means that your school is likely to have a concentration of poverty. You can see on the map over there, the dark red are schools with the highest percentage of low-income students. And when you attend that, there's a few things that happen. One is that you're more likely to attend a school with low-quality teachers. You're also more likely to attend a school in a dangerous neighborhood where students maybe can't even go outside for recess. Or possibly they don't have as many resources. If you're interested in that, there's a series of books by an author named Jonathan Kozol who does a lot of research on that. Really interesting. And then that education gap keeps going up through high school. If you may have heard of this, it's called a dropout factory. But that's classified as a high school where no more than 60% of the incoming freshmen make it to senior year. That's 1 in 10 American high schools, and those aren't spread out equally though across the country. They're largely found in the poorest of inner cities or the poorest of rural areas. So it's hard to keep a high school stable when that many students are dropping out all the time. Your book had a little information on poverty and health, but I just wanted to cover a few more factors they didn't discuss. One is that people living in poverty have higher rates of obesity. So this bar chart over here breaks you down by income quintiles, like the wealthiest people are on the left and the poorest people are on the right, and you can see that the obesity rate climbs, as does being sedentary and the rates of diabetes as well. There's a lot of different reasons for that. We'll talk about some of them later. They may have access to Medicaid or some other sort of subsidized insurance. Many doctors don't like accepting Medicaid, so you're limited on the medical care you can receive. If you, for whatever reason, don't really qualify for some sort of insurance, you're also more likely to need to go to a medical clinic with long lines that you may not really have time to wait in. Another thing that influences health is that high poverty neighborhoods are more likely to have poor air quality, so you'll develop respiratory problems. And you're also more likely to live in a food desert, which is where you're more than a mile from a grocery store and you don't have car access. And I'm sure a lot of you can sympathize with that as college students. It means that you need to buy a lot more convenience foods, which tend to be processed and less healthy. And like we mentioned with dropout factories, food deserts tend to be clustered. This has a map of them. And those are largely high poverty rural areas, but it also does exist in high poverty urban areas as well. Another thing where poverty has an influence is family structure. So this is a relatively recent change in demographic trends, which is that poor couples are increasingly choosing to have children before marriage. And while it's true that they are often in a committed relationship when they have the child, 80% of these relationships where you have your children before marriage tend to break up before the child's third birthday, which is compared to only a third of married couples. So they are more likely to be unstable, and that overall the marriage rates are lower and the divorce rates are higher. And when you have that, you just have a lot of family instability for both the couple and the children. And then lastly, let's talk about poverty and housing. So one thing is that you're more likely to live in a multi-generational household, which is where you would move in with your aunt or your parents or your grandparents just to try to make ends meet. There are some good things to that. It can lower your overall poverty rate because you're helping each other out with rent and things. But it means your median household income is a little lower, it has to stretch further. And if any of you have ever lived in one of these, you'll know that there are both good things and bad things. It can cause a lot of extra tension. You may have too many people in an apartment, which can make it unsafe or overcrowded. Um, they also may qualify for subsidized housing or to live in a housing project, which is great, gets them off streets, but especially in housing projects, they have really high rates of crime, drug, and gang violence. They just recently had an article in the New York Times about how the elevators are hotbeds for all sorts of assault and robbery, and so you're living in a place where you don't even want your kids to come and take the elevator. So clearly there are some trade-offs there. So I hope that watching this, what it helps you understand is that your social class doesn't just influence what you buy, it influences all portions of your life, and that you could write this about how being middle class changes your housing, education, health, and family options. You could write this about how being upper class changes these options, that it really is a substantial part of your daily life and not just a broad category about you.